If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. What's your best true scary, spooky story? The scariest thing of it happened while camping. So I live in Eastern Oregon, and my mom lives in Western Oregon. I went to visit her for the summer and she's very outdoorsy, so we decided to take the 1-hour drive from her city to the coast. We end up at this free campsite at the top of this hill, huge foothills of the coastal mountains, about a 25-minute drive from the top where the campsite is to the bottom where the main road was, and we were the only campers there. We relaxed for the rest of the day, made food, etc. A truck full of men drive up the hill and talk with my mom. Ike, what about, wasn't suspicious at the time, and they leave us. Fast forward to the middle of the night. I wake up to my mom sitting straight up in the tent. I wake easily, so I heard her gasp and it woke me. As soon as she saw I was awake, she put her hand over my mouth because I was starting to ask her what's wrong. It was dead silent, and all of a sudden you hear footsteps right beside the tent. The little flap that covers the zipper was even moving. Thankfully my mom has quick wits and said very loudly, "Kenny, grab the gun." Kenny is my dad, although that doesn't matter, and mind you, he was not there, just us girls like I previously said. They left. No harm was done. Thank the Lord for my mama. I have had several dreams similar to what I am posting. I've been a caver in Florida for about 13 years, since I was about 6, and have been to a lot of caves. Never been afraid before this to go in one. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I started having this reoccurring dream. I would have it at least twice a year, always the same, even though I would realize I was dreaming after the first few iterations. I would fall asleep and dream of being in a cave and going into this little hole in the bottom. Inside I would see a 10 to 15 foot long corridor about 2 to 4 feet high. At the end it would always turn left, and I always saw a bent red stop sign at the end, like someone ripped off the top 2 feet and tossed it in. But I would always follow the corridor. I would turn and walk past the sign despite being scared, despite many times knowing what was there, and the corridor would start descending, quickly opening up into a large vertical chamber with the path leading down in a corkscrew. Everything became blurry at this point, but it was always the same. I saw trash scattered on the walls. I saw the pit leading down to a curved floor. I saw things, undefined, animals or people or something else at the bottom. And I saw my family, each with one of the things, being tortured and killed. Every time. And I could never do anything. After I saw that, I would be stuck for a few seconds until I felt more than saw everything turn and look at me. And I would wake up. Not like a normal dream where you just drift to consciousness or a nightmare where you bolt up in fear, but like something pushed me out. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. So I had this dream multiple times a year until I turned 15. I did tell a friend about the dream before. What happens next? My father decided to take us to some caves we never had been before. One of which was Dog Drop. It was likely named so because someone either threw their pet in there or a coyote fell in and the body was later discovered. Dog Drop had a roughly 30-foot rappel straight down to enter. I went down with my brother while my father waited up at the top. There was a hole in the ground. I started to feel uneasy, though I didn't know why. So I followed my brother into the hole. I felt worse as I moved down. And when I looked up I saw the same corridor, the same turn, the same wall, the same bottles at the corner. And I instantly was hit with this overwhelming sense of nausea and fear and being watched, and everything was screaming at me to leave. I froze and must have made some noise because my brother turned around and asked what was wrong. I managed to say I wanted to leave now and climbed out as quickly as I could, followed immediately by my brother. We packed up and left, never have gone back and never will. Haven't told anyone what actually happened, just said I wasn't feeling well, and they forgot pretty quickly. The thing that really makes it creepy for me is I have never had the dream again. Year after year I would have it consistently, but it just stopped after that. But I still remember it all. And I still feel afraid, almost an external fear, when I think of it. Growing up on an Indian reservation, almost everyone has a spooky story. I've had a few experiences but nothing overtly spooky. But one of the best ones I've ever heard was from one of my uncles when he was younger. He grew up on the Standing Rock Res, Fort Yates specifically. South of Fort Yates, on the South Dakota side, is a town called Mobridge. It's about 30 miles away, and when it's nice out, people from Fort Yates will walk that 30 miles to Mobridge for the bars and whatnot. Usually catching a ride partway. It's an ugly little county road, and because alcoholism is so prevalent down there, there's been a lot of drunk driving deaths on that road. Anyway, one morning, he's walking back from Mobridge after a night of drinking. It's like 6 in the morning and he said he figured he had slept and was sober enough to walk back. He said he had been walking for about an hour or so when he came over a hill and saw a girl walking from the field to meet him on the road. He said she was native and dressed in regular jeans and whatnot, but like super pretty, so he figured she was just some girl walking down to Mowbridge or up to Fort Yates. So she meets up with him on the side of the road and she starts talking to him. He said she was asking him if he was hungry and saying he looked tired, and that he should come with her to her home so he could eat and rest. He asked her where she lived because he didn't see a house and she pointed to these trees about a mile away. He thought the trees probably blocked the house so he couldn't see it. He said she just about convinced him to go with her when he looked down and saw that her feet were backwards. He said he froze, stopped talking and turned around to start walking back toward Mowbridge. She was following him, telling him that he was going to die on that road and he should just come back to her home because it'll be warm, and that he could sleep with her. But he just ignored her and kept walking, not saying a word. He said she must have followed him for about 10-15 minutes before a car coming from Fort Yates stopped and picked him up. As he was getting in the car, she kept telling him not to get in because he was going to die in that car in an accident. When he got in and they started driving, he asked the people in the car if they heard what she said, but they told him that he was walking alone. In our culture, we have these things whose name roughly translates to tree witch, and he was fully convinced that's what was talking to him that morning. I've told story about some weird thing I saw in the woods at my grandparents' house. Silhouette of a deer against the curtain suddenly changed into a man's silhouette. Usual suggestions are skinwalker or Wendigo, though one I liked was maybe it was just Pan joking around, but I'm gonna read about another instance of weird shit. This was at the house we lived in for about 7 years. Many strange things happened in that house. You could hear voices murmuring from time to time. I saw a shadow person, saw someone stick their head into the room once. None of it felt hostile, but the same couldn't be said for this pervasive feeling my mother and I both felt if we went out front at night. She and I both felt like there was something watching and it wasn't friendly. On this particular night, it was about midnight or so and I felt like driving to the 24/7 grocery store since I wanted some snacks. As I stepped out the front door, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, and turned to look. There was this very tall thing just floating. For lack of a better term, I'd almost describe it as hanging, but there was nothing holding it up, outside of my brother's window. It was seemingly covered in a sheet that had once been white, but was extremely dirty, so it was more off-white, and got brown with mud and dirt the further down it went. There were no visible feet, nor eyes or face, but I could tell it was staring at my brother's window. As I stared at it, it turned to look at me and I remember feeling like one of those butterfly specimens, pinned to a board. It was as though its stare was physically holding me in place. It felt like an eternity, but only a second or two passed, and it looked back at the window, the pressure lifting, and then vanished. Right as it vanished, there was a fluttering of wings in the tree above, and one of our neighborhood's owls came to perch there. In a way it felt like the owl came to my defense, as silly as that may sound. Our cul-de-sac loved the pair of owls. They were more like neighbors to us, so maybe it was just protective of a fellow neighbor. That's how I like to think of it, anyway. In any event, I decided that it might be best to just make some popcorn or something that night instead. The house I lived in from when I was about 13 till I was 24 had some darkness. I remember hearing stories from my parents that the son of the previous owner had OD'd, but not within the house, somewhere else. Still, that always creeped me out a bit. Throughout my entire time living there, I saw and heard all the classic signs of haunted house. We had a glass cube wall, very 80s, that separated the living room from the dining room, and I saw all sorts of shadows running past on the other side in the dead of night when I would stay up watching movies or gaming. There was never anyone awake when I'd go look. One night when I was about 15 years old, I was sleeping in my room, when all of a sudden I wake up. I used to have this HP laptop that would let off a blue light when closed, just dim enough to check the time from my wristwatch that was laying next to it. I don't know why I didn't have a regular nightstand clock. As I'm squinting to see the time, I hear something whisper my name right next to my ear. It was as if it was standing an inch from me. I jumped up out of bed, scrambled out of my room, knocking shit over in the process. I didn't stick around to see what else I could hear. I ran to the living room and passed out on the couch till the next day. For the next few nights I couldn't sleep well and kept waiting for it to speak again. Never did. The house came with a camera system installed, and I remember seeing all sorts of wacky things. The back fence door opening on its own, when it had 2 clip locks. Granted, they're the locks that you only need to push up to get it to unlock, so it could have been a strong wind, but something about the movement of the door unnerved me. I can't explain it, it was something I felt in my bones. I learned to live with that feeling during those years, but it was always there. I lived in an old apartment in 2002. The place was built in 1900, so it was just over 100 years old when I moved in. The living room and kitchen were fine, but the bathroom and bedroom were unnerving, like I just always felt like I was being watched, especially in the bedroom if the closet door was open. Those unnerving feelings just became moderately uncomfortable as I settled in. I felt safe in the bedroom, but only if the door was locked. One night I was dead asleep when there was a loud bang on my bedroom door. When I got up the courage to get out of bed, I checked the apartment and all the windows were closed and locked from the inside. The door still had the chain secured. No one was in there. I mentioned the closet in the bedroom. I never liked going in there, and I never liked if the door was open. For some reason, in my head I would hear gasping noises. So for that reason, the closet stayed closed. A month or more after I was woken to the bang on my door, I was dead asleep. But something woke me up, and it was a pressure on me like being held down. It was pitch black in my room, I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone was standing over me. When I could finally turn on a bedside lamp, no one was there. After that I couldn't sleep in the dark, I had to sleep with a lamp on. That incident scared the life out of me. And after that the unnerving feeling of being watched intensified. Friends would come over, and comment about being uncomfortable in the bathroom like being watched. It became so uncomfortable for me, when I had the chance to move to another unit, I jumped at it. I packed up and got out. After me, several people rented the apartment, and they would move out within months. I became friendly with the building manager, and I told him that I felt the place was haunted. He kind of laughed it off. Years after, they were renovating the place, building manager was doing some painting in there, the building owner was there too. I went and checked out the apartment, and it looked nicer, it didn't feel as creepy. I got to talking with the building owner, and through the course of conversation he just throws it out there that a former tenant committed suicide in the closet by hanging themselves. He also mentioned that the original designer of the building lived in that apartment, and died in there. I wasn't mad when I heard that, but felt validated that what I experienced was real. When my grandparents bought their house for a family of 10, my grandpa found a fake wall upstairs. He tore it down to make more room for the family. Behind the wall were children's clothes and play toys, almost like they walked off the room in a hurry. My mom told me stories of sitting in her room and something circling the walls around her sounding like wallpaper being torn. When she moved out, my aunt moved into the same room. She would wake up with pictures she hung up laying on her chest in the morning. My cousins also have stories of hearing footsteps coming up the stairs and stopping outside their door in the middle of the night. I still don't go upstairs at their house because it's always cold and I get weird vibes up there. Even in my adult life I have scary dreams that take place in their upstairs. This happened about 1 week ago. I set up an appointment to view an apartment in a part of town that's a bit less traveled. It's not a bad area, it's just kind of industrial / out of the way, so not much traffic around. I waited for about 30 minutes for the real estate agent to show up, but she never did, so I left because it was freezing. I make the first right turn out of the neighborhood and come to a red light about a block down. As I was pulling up to the red light, I see what appears to be a man and his child, a little boy no more than 4 or 5, walking down the street heading toward a little cafe. However, the man stops short of the cafe and instead heads into the liquor store located on the corner, without the little boy. I can now see the little boy more clearly as I come to a full stop at the light. He is holding a tiny green book in his hands, looks to be of Asian descent, has shoulder-length black hair that is blowing furiously in the wind, and he's crying. You know that crying face kids make when they're lost in a department store and can't find their mother or father quickly enough? That's what this kid was doing. At this time, I see another man walking toward the kid and rationalize that he is the boy's father, but the man passed the kid and kept on walking. I watch the boy for about 10 more seconds, while he walks up to the cafe window and peers inside as if he is trying to find his parent. No one looks at him, no one notices he is staring in the window. He realizes no one is paying attention to him and turns around to find me staring at him. We locked eyes for about 5 seconds while he is just standing there crying, in a tiny blue windbreaker in 15-degree weather, clutching his little green book close to his chest. I decide in that moment, since no one is with him, and his jacket is way too thin for the weather, that I will pull over as soon as the light turns green to wait with him until whoever he was looking for comes back. In the same instance, an SUV pulls up next to me, causing us to lose eye contact, but I can still hear him crying. The light turns green not even 2 seconds later. I put on my hazards to pull over, the SUV zooms off and there is no little boy in sight. I quickly glance into the cafe to see if he ran in there, nothing. I look in the liquor store, nothing. He just vanished. And I drove home in complete silence trying to decipher what the hell I had just witnessed. While at uni my friends and I ran out of booze. Hardly any shops were open because it was late on, so the only option was to walk the mile or so to the nearest 24-hour supermarket. Between the supermarket and the dorms we lived in was just row after row of suburban houses which all looked the same. As we were walking down one road we passed a field with a large campfire and some people riding horses around it. There were people playing musical instruments, and general sounds of a good time going on. The horses and fire, and the lanterns which were dotted about, gave it a very old-fashioned feel. Maybe 5 minutes after passing the field, now walking past houses again, one of my friends commented on how weird and out of place that gathering of people had been. My other friend and I had been thinking exactly the same thing, so, curious, we turned around and walked back to find out exactly what was going on. There was nothing there. Not just no people or horses, there was no field, just more and more houses. Even though we were absolutely certain we were on the right road, as we'd simply turned around, we walked up and down the neighboring roads too. We found nothing. We weren't drunk, though we'd had some drinks, and so I've got absolutely no idea what happened that night. Back when I was a kid, my grandmother had a really close friend who used to help her babysit us. One day she goes missing. Family doesn't know where she is and we don't either. About a week later police find her body in a dumpster. She had been dead for 4 to 5 days. She had been mugged and had several stab wounds. Incredibly tragic, who would mug an old lady? Here's the spooky story. A few days just before she was found, my 3 cousins swore they saw her walking around in their backyard and knocking on their window. The following day had search going through the area. It wasn't until the body was found that we realized what they saw couldn't be true according to police timeline, but they swore it was her. So this story is about an uncle of mine. He was a nice man with a loving family. He worked as a Muslim missionary where he traveled the world and talked about Islam, corrected people's misunderstandings, not an extremist, but corrected the extremists themselves, anyways. He loved to travel as well and heard about a village in Malaysia who apparently practice a lot of black magic and curse people using demons. I know it sounds weird, but I wouldn't have trusted the story as well if it wasn't in the family. So he decided that these people are causing problems for their neighbors and it would be better to go and talk to them about Islam. He went even after copious efforts for him not to meddle in something like that. However, he was determined to help these people from at least stop cursing others. He went to the village and camped around for 10 days trying to convince people, but it was to no worth. They didn't listen and they attempted to kill him or sacrifice him for the greater good of the village. So naturally he came back. This all happened roughly 2 months ago. He came back to his normal life but would feel weird. He started hearing voices, cries and screams. According to his family, he couldn't be left alone because he would try to fight the voices and throwing things. His family was very patient with him, but after 1 month exactly, he could hear someone call his name for any corner in his room and eventually hung himself. I don't know what happened, but we're sure he was cursed badly. 4 years ago, I lived in a very large farmhouse that was converted into 2 apartments. The house was known as the old boys' home. It was used to house boys with behavioral issues but was closed due to allegations of molestation. Anyway, I was living with my boyfriend and 3-year-old daughter at the time. My bedroom had a large fireplace that had been boarded up and painted over. I decided to push my bed up against it one day while I was rearranging things. It was like a headboard. That night, around 1 a.m. I had heard a small voice saying, "Mom, Mom, Mommy." I had sat up in bed but didn't see anything, so I reached over my boyfriend trying to grab my daughter and put her in our bed. I kept feeling around and I was still hearing the voice but I couldn't feel her. My boyfriend woke up and turned the bedside lamp on, asking me, "What the hell are you doing?" I explained that Amelia was trying to get in our bed and I was reaching for her. There was nobody there. My daughter was sound asleep in her room. Then the next night came. Around 1 a.m. again my dog had started to whimper at outdoors, so my boyfriend got up to take him outside. You know that feeling in a bed when someone lies down next to you? Where the bed pushes in and there is a warmth in your back? I felt that, so I assumed my boyfriend had come back to bed. I rolled over, my boyfriend wasn't in the bed and I felt the fucking bed release pressure. Whatever was laying next to me has gotten up in that second. I moved my bed the next day to the other side of the room and I never had another incident in the 2 years I remained in that house. In high school my friends and I were messing around with a Ouija board one night. We had done it before and nothing remarkable had ever happened. We usually did it to try and scare each other or our girlfriends. We all thought it was a joke. That night there was no one else home except the 7 of us and we were all together around the board. One of the girls there wanted to try it. She had never done it before. This time was different. The board misspelled some of the words the same way every time. It gave answers that seemed really historically accurate for our town, Things we neither knew or cared about. Long story short, the spirit claimed it was a 10-year-old boy who had died on the property in the 1800s and was buried there too in an unmarked grave. My friend's house was on a farm in the edge of town. We were all a little freaked out because the board had never been so detailed and consistent. However, we were still skeptical and we were all assuming one of us was trying to scare the rest. Finally, my friend asked if the spirit could do something to prove he was there with us. It went to yes and then spelled out KNOCK. Then the planchette stopped moving. We just all stared at it silently, and then there was a rap on the window right next to us. The lights were on outside and there was absolutely no one out there. We never touched that effing board again. My wife and I stayed at a nice hotel in downtown Pittsburgh. It was where I asked her to marry me after a lavish meal. I picked the room because it came with a huge Japanese soaking tub that me, a 6 feet 1 inch man, could barely see over the edge of. Anyway, the first night we stayed there, we were sleeping in the single king bed. I believe the alarm clock said it was 2 or 3 a.m. To my left, and just a few feet from me, I heard the sound of what seemed like a pencil slowly rolling down a sloped surface. It was so deliberate and loud that it woke us both up. It was also so deliberate that, while my heart thumped in my chest from the sudden noise, I quickly convinced myself that it was a pencil sliding off the desk in our room, and I went back to sleep. The next morning, to my surprise, I found that A, there were no pencils in the room, and B, there was no desk. It was my first night in the room, so I assumed that it, like other hotels, had a place to sit and write. Well, that was not the case. The only thing I could find to write with were ballpoint pens with their caps on. They wouldn't make that distinctive, loud noise that a ridged, wooden pencil makes as it rolls. Furthermore, there was no sloped surface in the room for anything to suddenly roll off of in the middle of the morning. The whole thing was weird enough for us to talk about it that morning. I do not believe in ghosts, but to be honest, I'd love to encounter something unexplained. I entertained the idea of a ghost pencil, but knew in my head it had an explanation grounded in reality. But that's not all that happened. That night we were both in the soaking tub. The water was up to my chin. It was great. We were in the middle of February, a cold and miserable month in Pittsburgh. We were sloshing around in the tub having a blast, pretending we were rich. And then, from the other room, we heard the buzzing of an old microphone hooked up to a PA system. Basically, that sound of feedback that precedes an announcement. The whole room filled with the buzzing sound of microphone feedback. Our hearts thumped in our chests yet again. And then we both practically jumped out of our own skins. We heard the distinctive sound of someone blowing into a microphone to test it. Woof woof. You could see it in your head, it was so distinctive, just like the pencil. My heart went from thumping wildly to thrumming like a hummingbird's. Naked, I leapt from the tub and threw a towel around myself. That was a man blowing into a microphone, I said. My wife stayed in the tub, scared and quiet. I searched our room and did not find a speaker, or any kind of speaker grill embedded into a wall or the ceiling. We could not for the life of us find a potential source for the sound other than an iHome speaker that was already playing music from my iPhone. So that was our story. We still had one more night. We were exhilarated by our engagement and the ghosts that haunted the hotel. A week later I had the thought to email the hotel. I asked them about their building. Pittsburgh is an old town. And downtown Pittsburgh is a very, very old town. They got back to me and explained, as my jaw dropped, that they used to be an old telephone factory. I don't know why I found meaning in the explanation or why it made everything click so well. But my thoughts immediately went to the sounds of a factory, the PA system, the drafting table. All relics from another time in that building's life. This just happened to me 2 days ago. I was walking into the house after work around 6 p.m. so it was already mostly dark, and suddenly the entire sky lit up bright green, and there was a super loud zap sound just like a movie laser or something, right over my head, so loud that I hit the deck and then fucking tore ass back into the house. One of my roommates was cooking dinner and I was like, what the did you see that? But he didn't. We went back outside, no transformers near or out, no house's electricity out, no sign of disturbance at all. Now I'm a rational grown man, a believer in science and always that there must be a rational explanation for this guy, but this was truly a mindfuck and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. I'm from Scotland, and when I was a child, my mom and dad took my sister and I on a trip to Fort William, which is a town up in the Highlands. People go there for skiing and hiking. It wasn't winter, so we were there to do some easy hiking. My sister and I were quite young, I was about 11, and to stay for a couple of nights. I can't remember the name of the hotel we stayed at, but I do remember that it was old-fashioned, and we were all in one room together. There was a single bed, where I was sleeping, a double bed in the middle, my parents were there, and another single on the other side, my sister's. I was often frightened when I was a girl. I didn't like the dark, and I was super scared of the possibility of ghosts, etc. I never found it easy to sleep because of this, even at home. I vividly remember tossing and turning that first night in the hotel for a long time, before lying on my back and trying to calm myself down. I then felt the bed sink a little next to my feet. I heard the creak of the old mattress. Someone was sitting at the foot of my bed. My heart was honestly pounding. I hadn't heard my sister or parents get up, so I was terrified. Whatever was sitting there quickly moved, so it was sitting on my feet. I felt the weight of whatever it was. I heard the mattress creak again. My feet were freezing cold. It then moved off my feet, and settled down next to them again. The old mattress shifted and creaked again. Within a second or two, I felt the coldest I've ever felt, but not throughout my whole body. The coldness was slowly rising up from my feet, accompanied by a feeling of pressure. I was too scared to open my eyes. I was willing myself to call for my mom, but I was so scared that I just couldn't at first. When I managed to shout out and wake the rest of my family, the cold, pressured feeling had reached up to my knees. When the lights were switched on, the feeling vanished. I have no explanation for this whole situation. My dad slept in that bed the next night, and I stayed awake the whole night in the double with my mom. We moved into an old 3-story house that was built at the turn of the century. From the deeds we saw it was owned by a single woman for many years before being sold to a man, and then us, my husband and my grandmother. It needed a lot of work doing, but luckily the next door neighbor was a builder. He came in to do work while my grandmother visited my parents in another city. On the final day he said, "Your grandmother is always out working on the garden, it looks great." After I questioned him a bit, I realized he had been seeing a white-haired woman walking outside of the back bedroom window in the garden. It was definitely not my grandmother, she was 100 miles away. I never told him because he's really superstitious and probably wouldn't have come back. In the same house while we were eating dinner, I looked up and saw what looked like a huge black hooded figure hide behind the doorframe into the hallway. It was so big it looked like it was ducking down and peering into the room, before whipping up and away when I glanced over. That scared the hell out of me, particularly as I only looked up because the dogs were whining. I never went in that corridor again when the lights were off. When I was in high school, my uncle would throw me a couple bucks to help babysit his kids with my aunt. They lived in a 2-story house by the water, nice area. The kids were about 3 and 6. One day I was sitting in their den on my phone when I started to hear a baby crying. Thinking it was the 3-year-old, I headed to the bottom of the stairs to check and see if my aunt was up there dealing with it. I called for her a couple times with no response. The baby kept crying. I called for her one more time, and when I got no response I started walking up the stairs. Then I heard my cousins and aunt playing outside. All the hairs on my body stood up and I literally felt a chill run down my spine. I quietly turned around, walked down the stairs, got in my car and drove away. The baby was still crying when I closed the door behind me. A few years later I was drunk at a family party and told my uncle the story. He told me that he and his wife used to hear the baby too, and apparently the previous owners had a kid die of SIDS in that room upstairs. He's uber Catholic and had a mass said for the baby. He said after that it never happened again. Still gives me the willies when I talk about it though. I came home from work one day to grab my spare tires. My sister was away at school 7 hours away and neither of my parents were going to be home for another 5 hours at minimum. I ran in, changed my clothes, grabbed my tires, then drove to a garage to get them installed. I got home 2 hours later and as I walked into the living room, there was a chair just sitting in the middle of the hallway and was facing the front door. I thought nothing of it but didn't recognize the chair as being one that we owned. It was a standard metal folding chair that you would buy for a couple bucks at a retail store. I folded it up and propped it up against my dad's workbench in our garage. My mom gets home a couple hours later and I ask her in passing why she left a metal chair in the middle of the hallway. She tells me we don't own any metal chairs and she hadn't been home up until an hour ago. I told her I came home and there was a metal chair just sitting in the middle of the hallway after I had gotten back from the garage. She told me to show her the chair and when I went out to the garage to show it to her, it was gone. I looked high and low for that metal chair but couldn't find it. I swore to her that I wasn't on drugs and that I wasn't imagining things. She thought what I was telling her was strange but didn't pay much attention to it. I never saw that chair again, nor do I know where it came from or where it went. Okay, so this was probably 15-ish years ago now. When I was in high school, my group of friends used to spend a lot of time at a particular friend's house because it was huge. It was also quite an old house, but his parents were cool with us basically taking over when we were there. We'd make dinner for about 10 people, stay up late listening to music and playing video games, and they never minded. Anyway, one evening we're all sitting in his room, watching TV. It's dark and the lights are on but the curtains are open. Suddenly 2 different people on opposite sides of the room jump like they've been startled and look around. Both of them explain they saw in the reflection in the window, on the 2nd floor, just FYI, somebody walk across the room. None of us had moved. It freaked a few of the girls out and we had to calm them down a bit. Flash to a couple of weeks later, and we found a pack of cards in our friend's house that had letters on them. Somebody suggested we could use these as a Ouija board and figure out if our friend's house was actually haunted. We got a big wooden board, I think it might have been the top of a table once upon a time, arranged the cards in a circle around the edge with an extra 2 homemade yes/no cards, got a glass, and off we went. It started to answer questions, telling us it was a man who used to live in the house and who died there. We asked when he died and just got the answer long. We asked if he was moving the glass, and he said yes. This is where I decided to be dumb, and I asked if he could move anything else other than the glass. Yes. We all paused and listened for the sound of something moving, but nothing happened. We asked if he had moved something. Yes. Nothing happened again, so we moved on and asked some more questions. This was at 10:30 p.m. After a while longer we said goodbye. I think at least one of us was aware enough about Ouija board lore to know we had to close the conversation properly, and then a little later we all went home, a little spooked but enjoying it nevertheless. I walked home with another friend who lived nearby. As I walked in my front door, my mom called through to me to be careful in my room because a mirror had fallen off the wall earlier and they weren't sure if they'd picked up all the bits of glass. When I asked when this had happened, she told me about 10:30. The same time I asked the spirit to move something. I did not sleep well that night. When my daughter was 7, she kept asking me why I was smoking in her room late at night. I was a smoker at the time, but I never smoked in her room. I never smoked upstairs at all. I told her that I sure wasn't smoking in her room late at night or at any time, but she was insistent that someone was coming in, sitting on her bed and smoking. I was kind of freaked out, but I knew nobody was sneaking into our house just to catch a late night smoke in my daughter's bedroom. The house had belonged to the in-laws of my daughter's teacher at the time. So, her teacher asked her how she liked the new house and her new room, and of course, my kid says it's great, but someone smokes in my room at night and mom swears it not her. So, on parent conference night, the teacher pulls me aside and asks which bedroom our daughter sleeps in. I tell her and she says, I don't know what you believe and I don't want to offend you, but kid says someone is sitting on her bed and she smells cigarette smoke late at night. I'm getting ready for a deserved lecture on smoking around children, which I did not get. The teacher went on to tell me that her mother-in-law wasn't allowed to smoke due to health issues and that she would sneak into what was now my daughter's room at night for a few quick drags. My daughter's bed was in the middle of her favorite clandestine smoking spot. We actually lived in harmony with Hazel the ghost for quite some time. She had an annoying habit of putting things back where she thought they belonged, but otherwise, she was a fine ghost. She had said in life that she had no intentions of leaving her house even after death. I did end up having a chat with her about her chosen smoking spot though, and that stopped pretty quickly. I've told the first part of this story before on Reddit, so it may sound familiar. My old childhood home has 3 stories with a cellar and is built in such a way that the floors are thin. Sound travels very well through it. The basement has a piano, which my brother, a musician, spent a lot of time on as a teenager. To that end, one morning, I hear him playing and singing at the top of his, very distinct, voice. I yelled over the upstairs stairwell for him to shut up because he was being loud and obnoxious. Then, I remembered my brother wasn't home that day, he had gone out with my parents. Music stopped, and I investigated the basement to find it dark. For years, I was able to mostly brush this off as sound from outdoors or something I imagined, but this week, my brother and I are back home for the holidays. It happened again. Now, the basement stairwell leads into a corridor, and off the corridor are 3 rooms, a full bathroom, a laundry room, and the rec room, which holds the piano. I was showering with the bathroom door open. I got out, brushed my teeth, and all the while, I could hear my brother playing and singing from rec room. Not an unusual occurrence, but the music did stop on its own at some point. So, I finished what I was doing, put on my robe, and made my way back upstairs. My brother was standing in the kitchen. Now, there was absolutely no way he could have gotten upstairs without having to walk past me. I asked him if he had been in the basement at all, and he was rather insistent he hadn't been in the basement all day. I went back to check the cellar out to find nothing amiss. This isn't the crazy ghost story stuff that other folks have posted, but to this day this gives me chills. Early sophomore year in college, my girlfriend spends the night in my dorm room. She'd lost her virginity to me the night before, and this was her first time ever spending the night in a boy's bed. That morning, she's still half asleep, so I get into the shower. While showering, I'm 100% certain I can hear someone calling out my name. But hey, I ignored it. There's that thing where you end up hearing your own name in white noise. Just BC, it's something you're so attuned to hear. The weird thing was it sounded very loud, like it was being shouted, but also very, very far away, but also like the sound was coming from deep inside my own head. Like I was wearing headphones and hearing my own name called out in this tiny, panic scream. It was really odd, but again I dismissed it entirely. Finished my shower and went about my day, never mentioning it to anyone. 2 years later, we're sitting around in someone's dorm room and my girlfriend casually mentions, "Oh yeah, remember that first night I stayed in your room? And then you went to go to the shower?" I was freaking out because it was so dark in your room, and I started having a panic attack and started screaming your name in my head while you were in the shower. I try not to think about this too much, since I'm very much one of those science uber alles types of guys who likes to mock new age crap. But this was the one thing I've personally experienced that feels like it was legit supernatural. No ghosts or angels or any of that bullshit, just a tiny experience of straight up telepathy, or one really, really weird heck of a coincidence. I swear we ran into a man from another time. My stepsister and I were like maybe 9 and 11 years old, and we had ventured like 10 kilometers from the house into the forest to explore and play. Grew up rural, this is just what you do. We were way off the trail amongst these enormous valleys, by Ontario standards. Like the type that you can't just walk straight up because it's too steep. So this isn't an easy place to really get to, and there are very few houses that back onto this particular piece of land. We were walking about and chatting when all of a sudden this man appears like 3 feet from us wearing a cowboy hat and a suede-like vest. He walked by, again, not anywhere near any trail, and didn't say anything. Then all of a sudden we didn't see him anymore. He was heading downhill, so we should have had a good vantage point to continue seeing him, but he was gone. You'd think if you randomly came across any other person in such a place you'd be like, "Oh, hey, what's up?" Or "Hey, have a nice walk" or something. But he didn't even look at us, just walked by silently, then disappeared. At the time it was like meh, strange, and we continued playing around, but a few years later we realized how strange that was. Just inexplicable and odd. It was almost 1 a.m, and a strange man with a white t-shirt knocks on my door asking for help. After quick deliberation, where my father went outside to talk to the man, he told me to lock the doors and get the kids into the room. Upon closer inspection, the man had a faint smear of blood on the t-shirt. When I asked him if he needed aid for the suspected wound, he told me that it wasn't his blood. 5 minutes later, my mom calls the cops. 10 minutes later, when the cops came, it was an entire squad. I didn't get to see the action because I was inside of a bedroom huddling the kids into a circle while cop lights flashed brightly through the window. I heard screaming from the cops to tell the man to stop, a barking K9, and a loud boom, but it was most likely the taser. Afterwards, more cops came to clean the blood off our walkway, and because the man came to our house, we had the right to obtain an explanation. The man is a wanted serial killer from Georgia. I live in Texas.